Mystic Wanderer, a practical guide to mysticism with Stephen Weiss. This time on The Mystic Wanderer, I want to talk about balance and two ways to represent balance that I think are very important and that are used in mysticism are the Yin Yang and what the Buddhists call the middle way. And there are references to moderation and balance as well in the Bible and other places where it is difficult for us to be out of balance. It is actually, I believe, in many ways damaging for us to be out of balance and too much in one direction. And there are a lot of ways and a lot of directions that we can be pulled in life. And I think until we understand this concept of balance, that we can actually think we're doing well. If you remember last time I mentioned that I realized I was all doing, and I think that's part of a, sort of a Western mentality mindset where we need to be productive and we need to be successful and to feel fulfilled and accomplished and worth something. And if we don't, we often feel like a failure and that we've wasted our life and a lot of things like that. Which reminds me, if you hear there's videos and there's stories and interviews with people on their deathbeds, and it's never, get this, it is never, wow, I wish I had worked harder, I wish I had accomplished more. It's never that. It's always, I wish I had spent more time with my family. I wish I had enjoyed my life more. But somehow we don't see that until the very end. So right now, you can see this before the very end. You don't have to be on your deathbed to realize that you indeed can live a balanced life and a fulfilling life and not have the deathbed regrets of spending so much time in the hamster wheel, as we say. So I want to start with the yin yang, and it's so important. It's very much about balance, but it can be, you can see if you look at it, right? If you look at a yin yang and you say, well, there's a white part and a black part, right? And that's sort of like the beginning of how we start with our sort of dualistic thinking. We see them, this is a part and this is a part, but it's a whole, and it's a balanced whole. And I love how the traditional yin yang has the tiny bit of white in the black part and the tiny bit of black in the white part. And it's almost, I see it as a bit mischievous, right? It's like, oh, by the way, you're not going to have perfect yin or perfect yang. It's always going to have a little bit of the other in it. And I think we should see that as a very important truth, because we can try to be so good or so perfect, and we never will be perfect in any one direction, but we could be perfectly balanced, which is something we can do. But a lot of people end up with their lives and they're very much out of balance. And so we want to realize that when we look at this, so we look back at the yin yang and we see, okay, there's the two pieces, but they're one piece, right? So going past the original part where you say there's white, there's black, it's really a whole. And we want to see that it's a balanced whole. And it's really, instead of dual thinking, it is non-dual. And it really goes into the aspect that even if you think about it in physics, right? For every reaction, there's an equal and opposite. So we, in a sense, and this works for concepts as well as physical world, where if we have a concept or an idea, as soon as we hold on to that concept or idea, we've also brought the opposite of that idea into being, or the idea of the opposite of that. For instance, soft and hard, right? Soft implies that there's a hard, right? front implies that there's a back. But not only that, there is no front without a back. The two go together. They're part of a whole. And when we have that sort of realization of how existence is, that we can see the balance. And this is the thing that happens to me is I see it more and more in everything about how we can go too far in a certain direction or relying on a certain thing, but instead seeing that everything is related to everything else. But can we get to a place where we say the yin and the yang are both good and they're both part of the whole? And this one perspective where we want to see this faultless self as what's perfect, but really what's perfect is the balanced self. And when we realize that there are so many things going on that make up our existence, and our existence as an I, as an individual being with the ego and the subconscious and emotions and the body that we're in and all that is directing us all the time, besides what we think of as our will. And we are never going to really be what we want to be in terms of one perspective where we think we want to be the best at something or successful, or we want to be, all of us want to be good, right? Maybe not all of us, but I'd say most of us want to be good. But one day you're going to realize you can't always be good. And then you can either despair or you can accept that. And somehow, in our flaws, in our imperfections, we are actually perfect and good. And it's hard to see it in ourselves, but imagine someone you love. Right now, I'm thinking of someone that I recently loved and I still love. And of course, when you get close to someone, you see their flaws. And I saw her flaws. And I chose to love them instead of thinking, oh, well, this is a problem, this is difficult, this is imperfection. How can I put up with imperfection? But instead, you love them. And so I think that if you imagine someone that you love very deeply and you at some point love their flaws, because that's how, when you deeply love someone, that's how it works. And so you can say, oh, right. They're not perfect in the one sense, right? But they're a perfect human in existence. They exist with just the right amount of flaws that they were meant to have and just the right amount of abilities. And they are perfect. They are exactly the way they're supposed to be. And I think I can't believe I haven't mentioned this earlier because it's one of my favorite quotes from Ram Dass. And I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but Ram Dass mentions that he likes to see everyone as trees. Because when we go out into nature and we look at trees, we don't think, oh, that tree could be better. That tree could have done a better job growing. Well, at least I don't. I don't know about you, but I think most people don't. We just look at nature. Oh, that's nice. That's a tree. We don't have these requirements for trees. But as soon as we see a human, our labeling system turns on, right? Our dual thinking system where things are always good or bad or better or worse, or I like this or I don't like this, right? And so then people become very imperfect to us, or they become very flawed very easily because of our idea that, hey, they should be like this. They should be, according to some standard that we made up. And of course, people have different standards, and there is no one straight standard, but not with trees. So if we see everyone as trees, right, how they grew, and we don't know what caused them to grow the way they did, in most cases anyway. But we accept them like, wow, that's a tree. And it's beautiful, and it's wonderful. And it's part of nature. And that's how we are too. We're just more complicated in that we're walking around and having thoughts about things and complicating the world. But if we live in a balanced state, we should be able to look at other people and see, oh yes, they are meant to. They are meant to have. We are meant to be in this state of perfection and imperfection at one level, but yet when you put that together, we are perfect. We are meant to be this way. And everything is relational, right? The yin is related to the yang, and that's why they have the little dot, right? They're mixed. They're always mixed together in some balance, right? And we see this, in the world. Everyone has a little bit of something. I am soft and I am hard, right? I am conscious and I am unconscious. I am male and I am female, right? There are aspects of me that are definitely female, and I'm glad for them because it balances me out. And different people have different, it doesn't have to be exactly 50-50, because then that would be another rule and that would be another perspective that has to be exactly like this, right? No, there's a mix, there's a relationship of the two forces, and many, many things in life. And of course, not everything, right? There are some things that come in threes, right? And there's a dance of how three of them work together, But many, many things are like the yin and the yang, and they're a balance. And as I said before, the whole idea of concepts, if we have a front of something, then therefore there is a back, right? Good implies evil. And what we are doing is splitting up the universe into boxes and containers when we label things. But often we don't realize that they are interdependent, right? Even though we put them in separate boxes, they're really a relationship. Front is a relationship with back. Up is a relationship with down. There isn't just up. There's down. And they're in relation to each other. And if you're going up from this earth, gravity is pulling you down. Even though you're going up, there's a relationship that's happening there. There's still gravity that is being applied. There are the forces out there, and they work together. And if we're out of balance, then we're not working together, right? And we'll be unhealthy. And, the Chinese have gone so far with this philosophy as to even label foods as yin and yang. And they strive for a balance, right? You should eat so many yin foods and so many yang foods. And I've even tried it myself, and I feel like it does help to sort of have at least an idea of what you're eating in terms of balance. So another thing I want to look at besides the yin yang is the Buddhist philosophy of the middle way. So to talk about that for a moment, right? If you know sort of the original, there's actually several Buddhas, but sort of the original Buddha was a prince, right? He had a very wealthy life and indulged in, hedonism, as we would say. And then one day said, no, this isn't it, right? There's got to be something more, and went out and went to a life of what we call asceticism, right? With self-deprivation, right? Living without, fasting, living without food and living without sensual pleasures and wearing beat up clothes and having nothing, poverty and fasting and depriving yourself, right? And, for many years and many philosophies had this idea that if you just completely deprived yourself, you would get the fast track to enlightenment. But what happened is he didn't find it there either. And that's when he proposed the middle way, where it's a balance, right? Between, we are, whether we like it or not, we are physical creatures. We are sensual creatures. And there's nothing wrong with, in itself, enjoying food or romantic relationships or, I don't know, television or any of these things, as long as we live in balance, where we also have the sort of other end of knowing when to deprive ourselves, of knowing when to not indulge, knowing when to be on the other side of that. And I think it's probably obvious that if we were sort of self-indulgent all the time, it would lose its taste, and we'd have to have more and more, and eventually we couldn't have more, and everything would be empty and tasteless. This was probably what happened to the prince. But now we could be overindulged with, as you can see, right? I'm not the first one saying this. We can be overindulged with our digital entertainment, social media, smartphones, so many distractions, so many things to do to occupy our time. But eventually, scrolling on social media doesn't feel like enough. Eventually, all the video games and all the Netflix, diminishing returns, as they say in psychology. So there is sort of an emptiness of being completely out of balance in that direction. And when you go away from these things for a while, then they regain their deliciousness, right? As they say. We have the same thing, I think, especially in America, where we eat too much sugar. And I work in nutrition sometimes, and I could talk about that all day, but definitely we have too much sugar. And especially our soda, it has a lot of sugar. And if you drink American soda, after a while, you develop a taste for it. But what happened to me is, I was very ill, and I was told, hey, don't drink soda, don't have any sugar at all, really. And after not having soda for 6 months, I decided to try a Pepsi, and it just tasted like syrup. It was horrible, right? Because my taste had returned to normal, right? I didn't have to have this blast of sugar for it to taste good anymore. So then, I could have the less sweet type of foods, and they would taste sweet. And I think that we do need these sort of periods. And so I think that, this goes into so many, right? There's so many ways we can look at this, where we need these kind of times of isolation, meditation, retreats, time alone. And then we need to be out in the world to exist as human physical creatures, right? And I think one of the biggest things, we need our relationships, right? And we need good relationships. And of course, there are introverts and extroverts, and they have different balances that they need, right? Extroverts need more interaction, introverts need less. But of course, if you put an extrovert around people all the day and never give them any separate solitude, they would probably go insane. And introverts, obviously, you don't want to lock them in solitary confinement forever with no human contact. So there's a balance, right? It's some of one and some of the other. And it's not always a 50-50, but we have to keep in mind that there are these paths. And if we go somewhere in the middle, right, that's where we're going to find balance. And so you can think about it, right? I mean, this whole spiritual life, the whole mysticism is a very spiritual thing. And it does sort of call out to you to do certain things, to take time to meditate, to contemplate, to remove yourself from the physical world, but always have kind of a toe in it. Just imagine like that little dot in the yin yang, to go back to that, right? We always are a little bit we're not totally gone in this, right? We're still in the body until we die. We are still here. So even though we can have these high spiritual moments, right? We don't leave the world. And so we are here, right? And then on the other hand is, when you enjoy like a good meal, right? Enjoy that fully. We talked about sort of with emotions before, fully experiencing your emotions. Well, when you do that, you can fully experience your dinner, right? Which is wonderful. There's a story, again, from Ram Dass, where he was doing a retreat and he would eat 1 or 2 M&Ms a day, I think what it was, but he got to the point where he focused on that M&M and ate it like little pieces at a time. And it was such a rich, full meal because he fully experienced, there was nothing else in the world but that M&M when he ate it. And it was just overloading and so much sugar and taste, and it was all he needed, right? It was, and I don't expect us to get there right away, but that's a way of focusing on something where we can fully experience. And so it's a strange thing, because at that point, right, he was doing kind of a retreat with fasting, yet because of the removal from the physical, that little bit of physical, that M&M was amazing, right? So we have this sort of, almost amplifying relationship where actually the physical and the spiritual can amplify each other. Now, really, the true mystic point of view is that everything is one, and we'll keep coming back to that. So really, there isn't a difference between physical and spiritual. Well, what has happened is that sort of when we are born into this world and when we exist, and when we start thinking and start rationalizing, we are the ones that create these lines and boxes around everything, and oh, this is spiritual and this is physical. But really, everything is, I would say, spiritual, right? And so physical is just a kind of spiritual, right? It's held together. As we talked last time, even the Bible, it said everything is held together by God, right? So it's spiritual, right? And nothing that exists did not come from God. So everything is from God. It's not just, physical, or some Westerners would call it secular, right? Which almost seems like a dirty word, right? It's not sacred, it's secular. But at this point, I believe that the Christ has reconciled everything to God, and everything has been brought back into union. So we make this sort of, so the whole thing of the yin and the yang and the middle way is really all something that exists because of humans and observation and thought and labeling. And then because we do that, we sort of need the reminder of the balance and things like that. But you'll see in Daoism, one of the interesting things you'll see in especially the Tao Te Ching, talks about this concept of the 10,000 things, right? And the 10,000 things really come into being because of us. Because we suddenly, instead of seeing everything as one, we see things as separate things. And so, boom, the 10,000 things arise, right? And that's their metaphor for all the different things, that we separate that are in reality. Now, really, in the Tao, in the oneness, there aren't the 10,000 things, or maybe more specifically, the 10,000 things are all part of the one. They're just different facets of the Tao. But we create them, in a sense, or create that separateness. So when you see that term in the Tao Te Ching, it's about sort of the creation of the separateness by our observation and labeling and thinking. But every time, right, I always think about when I see the 10,000 things, I think, okay, it spawned from or came out of the one, right? And those things are still all connected. So we want to keep that in mind. Some more specifics on the yin and yang. So the yin is associated with the feminine, and it's more receptive, inward, passive, definitely associated with the being part of the symbol. And then the yang is the active, the bright, the outward. Also the warm. The warm is more for the yang, and the cool is more for yin. Especially when you talk about foods too, they talk about that, like a milkshake it would be more yin, and then a soup, nice hearty meaty soup, would be like a yang, right? And so yang more about action and doing, and that's the symbolism there. And remember that has the little dot or the seed of each other in there. And we are meant to be in balance between, I believe, being and doing. And before I mentioned that, I sort of see us as our true self as these two different aspects, where one is the observer, which would be the yin, right? Just watching and seeing and being. And the other is the dancer, which is the pure unrefined action, right? Where we act with the universe. We act within the Tao and move effortlessly along with everything else that's happening, right? Without overthinking it or planning it. We just live in the moment. And that's sort of the dancer part of what I see as ourselves. So that's sort of our yin and yang in terms of our true self as well, the observer and the dancer. And again, we can tend to look at it and see it as separate pieces, but really it's a swirl, right? The reason it's not like a straight line is because it's like a wave. It represents movement or implies movement, that it's not always exactly like that. It moves in eddies, and it has different amounts of the yin and the yang at different times. And it can show us, spiritual and what we call physical. It can talk about ego and letting go of the ego, right? Where I talk about sort of the true self. But we have as I mentioned, the construct ego, and we sometimes, the ego, it's bad, whatever. It's not. It's something we have and that we work with. But the important part is balance. If we remember that we balance our existing in the ego with existing outside of the ego or without the ego, right? There's a higher perspective that we can live out where everything is perfect and exactly the way it's made to be. And in a sense, if we are going to trust the divine and realize that, the divine is everything and we are part of the divine and everything is existing and being and doing and all part of this amazing now, and that even ourselves, our individual kind of bodies and egos are part of a bigger whole, that really everything is okay and everything is safe and everything is fine. It's part of the experience of reality, and that we're safe. And then a lot of it is because we're afraid, right? We're afraid of suffering. And I think that's one of the things that mysticism has really helped me with, is that suffering is suffering. It is unpleasant physically and mentally many times. But the first step to making it less bad in terms of our human perspective is to not be afraid of it. Okay, there's going to be suffering. That's one side, right, of the yin yang. There's going to be the suffering. And there's so much pleasure and so much suffering. But we can get to the point where we can step outside and say the suffering is still good, which seems very difficult, right? Especially if we're sort of living in very physical, material type sense, and we see everything in terms of the world's fairness and everyone having the same amount of physical stuff, but it doesn't take into account the spiritual. In fact, people who have more physical stuff, I would say, have less spiritual wealth and perhaps even less happiness. So even though we may see it in that perspective as unfair and that they have more pleasure and happiness, they actually may have more emptiness and unhappiness. But if we are able to step back and say, you know what, suffering can be good, and how can it be good? Well, Richard Rohr talks about one of the ways to kind of awakening and enlightenment is to go through suffering. Because suffering makes us let go of things. It makes us let go of our expectations. Well, I was hoping to be happy. I was hoping to not be in pain or be in this situation, but here I am. So we let go of the expectation of being happy in that moment or having a specific thing that makes us feel happy. And through this suffering, eventually we come to a place where we realize that all the things we really liked and wanted aren't what's important. And we turn inward. And that's what makes a mystic, I think, is turning inward. And he says that it can come through deep suffering or deep love, maybe someone loving you that much. I don't know about the love part, but I definitely know about the suffering part, right? As I mentioned, I've had illness struggles and I've been physically ill for years at a time in my life and only been able to really come out of that by managing strict diet and and lifestyle changes and things like that. But eventually you can see that suffering brings you to a better place. And not everyone, right? Because it's sort of an invitation to accept. Do you accept this journey? Do you accept this invitation? You could become bitter and angry and I'm not blaming those people who do. Right? Because everyone, and this is the thing that I always say, and this is even before I was, really into the spiritual path, but every single person has been through experiences you don't understand. They've been taught by other people that you don't know what they've been taught. You don't know what it even feels like to be them. Do their eyes deliver the same type of signals to their brain that yours do? You don't know what anyone else's experience is like and what has formed them and what has hurt them and caused them to believe what they believe and do what they do. So you can't stand and be in judgment and say, oh, well, they should have been better. They should have used their suffering to become enlightened. Right? You can't. And I think it's, very important to realize that very early on with this path, right? That though we're on it and though some really amazing transformation can happen, we still don't get to a place where we're like, well, I'm further along than you. And in fact, there's a woman friend of mine a while ago that was said, well, I feel like I'm just not as far along the path as you are. And I said, that's not true, because everyone has their own path. You can't be so far along my path because you're not on my path. I'm on my path, right? And so in our sort of individual ego worlds and in this body and in this life, we all have these, I guess you would say nature versus nurture, right? We've got our genetics and we've got the things that have happened to us, and we hit this starting point when we're born and we walk this path. And it is different for each of these individual consciousnesses. But at the same time, an important realization in terms of understanding how we all are one is that underneath all of that, the nature and the nurture, is that observer, is that true consciousness. And we, in that sense, are all the same. We all are this pure consciousness having this earthly experience. And in that sense, we're all one. These mini consciousnesses have all been born from the divine consciousness and are still all connected to it. Right? We're all branches on that tree. Right? We can't exist without the connection to the divine. So once we realize that our separateness is sort of a temporary thing, it's sort of an illusion, then we can inwardly go toward being one with the divine. But all that to say that we don't want to be judgmental of someone else's progress. But in many cases, suffering can lead us to, it leads us to question everything, especially the longer it can go on. We eventually give up. And it's so interesting because for many years, I used to try to accomplish things by willpower. And then I realized there's an end to it. I have a lot of willpower. And I realized that, and I'm like, I can do a lot of things with it, but it does run out. It's finite. But what I've found that's much more powerful than willpower is acceptance. And that's sort of a passive thing. So you can even think of it as sort of yin and yang there, where willpower is sort of pushing against, accepting is allowing. And when we accept things the way they are, and when we don't resist them, which is something in the Tao called Wu Wei, which I will talk about in a later episode. But this kind of thing is very powerful, where we go with the forces that are going on. And I feel like there is sort of almost a limitless power to acceptance and surrender, because in that way we're becoming one with the divine. The willpower feels more like an ego-driven type of force. But surrender is letting go of the ego and embracing our true self and our oneness. And the divine is limitless. And I believe that source of acceptance is able to give us a way to progress out of things that willpower does not. And so when we are in suffering, we get to the end of our willpower and we just get to the point of acceptance. All right, I'm going to suffer. That's it. And then once you accept it, it loses its sting. Oh, it's just suffering again. I've done this. I've been here. And one thing you learn about suffering is that it ends because everything is impermanent. It's not going to last. But we are, in a sense, permanent, even though we're always changing. Our consciousness is eternal. We are divine. We are part of the divine. So there's so many things that we can look at to keep in balance. Again, I don't want you to regret your life and that you were so busy trying to accomplish things, and we could do the same thing with accomplishments where we try to accomplish things spiritually, right? And get caught up in that. So I don't want you to do that either. But we balance things like when to act and when to pause and wait. When to work and when to rest, or when to work and when to play. Right? When to deprive our senses and be quiet and secret and isolated, and when to indulge our senses and experience things. Right? The deliciousness of both of those flavors. Right? The flavor of, in a sense, nothing, which is still something, right? Nothing is something. But the flavor of nothing versus the flavor of everything. And they mix well together. And in relationships, right? Not being out of balance in relationships. And that I will leave to you to think about. There's so many ways that relationships can be out of balance. Of course, we see this, again, this is one of the other reasons that I have withdrawn from politics and political arguments, because it is out of balance. Especially in America, if you're here, right? Each side thinks their side is always right, and their way of doing things is always right. But it should be easy to see that sometimes being too soft is the wrong decision, and sometimes being too hard is the wrong decision. It needs a balance. But one side is all soft and one side is all hard, or whatever analogy you want to make. And it's out of balance, and I cannot fully be on one extreme or the other, because I can't live there as a person without hurting myself, without hurting others and judging others as well. So when you think about this, when you think about the yin and yang and the middle way, start as the observer, looking at your life and see where things are out of balance. And like I said before, my big thing was that I was all doing and no being. And I could just totally throw everything, all my efforts into being, and still I would probably just be about 50% balanced because of the natural tendency I have to do. And sometimes it's the right time to be quiet and not say anything, instead of maybe always wanting to say something, or maybe you don't speak when you should, right? How are you out of balance? So when we walk in the middle, we swirl with the yin yang, right? We're not making this into some kind of rule or exact 50-50 balance, because it's not. It is a realization and an understanding that our view of reality is often composed of two facets. And usually these facets are opposites pulling in different directions. But these opposites, in a sense, create each other, they need each other, and they wouldn't exist without each other. And though one is bright and one is dark, one is not good and one is not evil, they are all part of the trueness of the universe. So whatever that is in your life where you see that you're out of balance, start looking at that and see, how can I be more in balance? Because that is a beautiful path to be on, that middle way. And I don't know, the more it comes to me more and more, the more I think in this perspective, the more I see that, oh my goodness, this applies here too, right? And so we don't just all go in one direction or throw ourselves completely in one camp or the other. We see that the opposite exists because the original existed. They are two sides of the same coin, and they are all part of the one. And that's really the lesson, right? All of this stuff that we label and we imagine, it's all part of the one. We've created the separation in our minds, and sort of the being born into this world and the material world and the ego and everything is part of separation. We're part of the 10,000 things. Congratulations. But we can also, at the same time, have the perspective that we are one with everything. And that's another thing of the Yin Yang, is it teaches us that we don't have to live with just one perspective on things. Sometimes one perspective works and sometimes it doesn't, and we need another one. And in fact, we might need more than two. It depends on the time, the situation, and the part of your life and the path that you're on. There are different times for different perspectives. And so when we are able to see the opposite perspective, when we're able to see that it's all good and it all accomplishes the existence and oneness and the pure goodness of everything, then we'll really understand the yin yang and living in balance. So be in that moment, watch everything swirl, and be aware that while there are two things, often they're really part of the one. The Mystic Wanderer